So, hi, Julian. Thank you very much for joining me today.
You're very welcome, Stephen.
And yeah, our starting point for today's conversation is going to be magic. So, I thought maybe you could say something about what magic is to you and how you've come across it, how it's part of your life.
Okay, well, it's a really interesting question. It's the most difficult place to start in the sense that what is magic is, for me, something of a koan, really. It's a strange and peculiar question. It's very slippery. So on the one hand, magic, I guess, might be thought of as just a placeholder that we use. It's a word that we use for something that we find mysterious or impossible to understand, including sometimes our responses to things. So a response might be, oh, that the band played and they were magical. Yeah. So an everyday incident takes place, but our response to it is to have some sense of the miraculous, the magical in it. We can think of magic as a historical series of narratives and actions in the world. So we can think of magic as being the kinds of things that very often members of orthodox religious kind of structures would have been doing, which were kind of slightly on the edge of what was acceptable. So summoning angels in, say, medieval magic, or finding ways to interact with demons to make them do things for you. So a sort of spiritist model of magic. Then we've got kind of ideas like in Greek culture and in the Hermetic tradition, where magic is about somehow becoming God, or kind of it's a big transcendent spiritual process, the sort of thing that we think of as maybe the stages of illumination that one might go through in a meditative practice, like Theravada Buddhism, for example. And then we've got magic, which is things like witches' spells, healing ceremonies, and the magic that shades off into what today we think of often as kind of shamanic practice. So magic is these many, many different things. It's parapsychological phenomena. It's all kinds of stuff. It's to some extent all the things that are kind of excluded from many other aspects of culture. They're kind of slightly on the edge and a bit dodgy, and that's what magic is. It's in some respects it is an uncertainty, mystery. That's why for me, I describe my practice often just as I'm an occultist. I'm interested in that which is hidden, and magic can be seen as both the response to that which is hidden and also the technology of engaging with that which is hidden. So I guess that's what it is to me right now.
And how did magic come into your life, or how is it part of your life nowadays, would you say?
I guess I have always been interested in magic. So I've always, from as long as I can remember, been interested in all kinds of weird stuff. Yeah, so parapsychological phenomena, UFO phenomena, Loch Ness monster, all kind of. I was always interested in Fortean subjects and these kinds of things. I was equally interested by things like human psychology, and very aware as I was kind of getting into magic from fairly early on that this was a really complicated field where there was no sort of single answer, and that really appealed to me. Actually, the idea that it was kind of about sort of a series of practices to explore what might be possible. So from very early, I started doing stuff. I started trying to cast spells. I tried various practices. I would go through lots of the books in the library, and I would mine them of the technology. Like, what is it you actually do? How do you do this stuff? And I started meditating when I was about 10, and then started yoga seriously kind of about a year or so after that. And then by the time I was 16, I managed to get involved with a Wiccan coven. And so the rest, as they say, is history. So I've just always been fascinated by this piece of human behavior. Yeah, let's call it this weird thing. Yeah, it's just what I really dig.
And so one more distinction we might make is between magic with a C and magic with a K, or ending in a C and ending in a CK. The magic ending in a C often referring to performance magic, stage magic, if you like, whereas the magic in a K is more associated with this kind of with the occult. A new relatively recent breed of magic, as I understand it, is chaos magic, again with a K. And could you say something about what chaos magic is?
Well, I mean, thanks for that distinction between the C and the C and K. It's interesting because actually, if you look at the chaos magic texts for various reasons that if you can be bothered to listen to the subtleties of this narcissism and minor differences, you'll understand why. Chaos magic is without a K, typically, at least in the books by Pete Carroll, who was one of the early writers about the subject. So chaos magic was an approach to magical practice which developed in Europe in the latter part of the 20th century. It was heavily influenced by Discordianism, by the things like the work of Robert Anton Wilson, so it had a humorous element to it. It was highly praxeological. It was very much like a DIY punk influence. So it was like about saying, yes, there may be all kinds of metaphysics, there may be all kinds of theory about this stuff, but what really matters is going and doing it. Yeah, so it was the kind of the magical equivalent of, look, if you want to start a band, just pick up a guitar and try and make noise. It was also, and the reason it drops the K is that it was also kind of antithetical to some extent, or it was set up by magicians who wanted to have a style of magic that was not bound in what they, I guess, thought of as another kind of theology. So Aleister Crowley's magic, and Crowley is most famously the person who adopts the CK spelling for a variety of reasons. His style of magic, on the one hand, as an individual, he spent a lot of time saying, look, you've got to find your own way through the universe and decide on your own style and blah, blah. But he also brought you quite happily to the altar of a religion he created called Thelema. So at the time that chaos magic evolved in Europe, there was thelemic magic. There were people who were basically really influenced by Crowley's work and doing stuff that was to a greater or lesser degree based on the material Crowley had already provided, or they were interested in Wicca, they were interested in witchcraft and the modern pagan revival. And what chaos magic sought to do was to say, look, you don't actually need an overall belief system. Like I have no idea how, or indeed if magic even works, but I know that there's a whole repertoire of technique which can allow me to explore the boundaries of what may or may not be possible, at least with regard to the realm of the imagination. And so chaos magic privileges the doing of the stuff. And so although I didn't come into working in chaos magic as in terms of some of the chaos magic organizational groups till about 15, 16 years ago, it's always kind of been my style. So it's this highly eclectic system. It's very much about doing rather than theorizing, although that doing includes things like reflecting and considering and listening. It's not always about activity. But it says, there may be many, many views of how this process may or may not happen, and they may have different things that inform us in different ways, different insights that inform us in different ways.
So can you give us some idea of some of the techniques of chaos magic? What do chaos magicians actually do?
Okay, so one of the influences on the emerging style of chaos magic was a magician called Austin Osman Spare, who was an artist who was born towards the tail end of the 19th century, lived through to the mid-20th century. He was an artist magician, and he developed a style of sorcery which was very, very personal in a kind of William Blake kind of a way. But one of the techniques that he developed was a thing called sigillization. And when we talk about chaos magic, one of the classic techniques, if you like, is sigillization. Sigillization essentially means writing down an intention or a desire, perhaps one might call it, writing it down in letters, and then taking the letters and from that going through some sort of a process that eventually end up with a kind of a monogram, so a graphic image, which is derived from that statement, that written statement of intention, into a graphical form. That image, according to Austin Spare's idea of this, it kind of embodies the intention, but in a way that the conscious mind can't recognize. It doesn't look like what it means. It's just an abstract symbol. And Spare's approach was then to go through a process of changing consciousness, and he had lots of different ways of doing this, sort of meditative processes and breathwork processes, and to imagine that symbol then somehow glows with energy, or that, metaphorically it comes alive. And then that symbol might then be disposed of in some way, so taken away from consciousness. It might be burnt, it might be buried, it might be perhaps eaten if it's on a piece of rice paper or something, it might be set on fire, whatever. And symbolically, what's happening is this is a piece of what people like Fraser would have called sympathetic magic or mimetic magic. So there's an idea that as this symbol, as this sigil is taken down into the unconscious mind, so it's rather like a seed. It sits there and it grows and it forms, it manifests in some sense. So that process of sigilization, that process of creating an intention, distilling it down to a graphic image, empowering the graphic image in some way, and then often taking that image and sort of setting it free so that it manifests in reality. That would be a kind of a classic example, if you like, of chaos magic. But chaos magic is an approach to magic more broadly. So chaos magic is also utilizing things that look like either very highly traditional esoteric practices or practices from religions, but also very kind of contemporary modern approaches to changing awareness, changing consciousness, setting intention, all of those sorts of things. So broadly speaking, it's all this repertoire of technique and this approach to technique, but obviously as a narrative, it has things like sigilization as being very closely associated with that style.
So if we just dwell on sigil magic for a second then. So I've heard this phrase, fire and forget. Once you've created this, the sigil, it's considered by many uncharged. We then use some process to charge up the sigil and that, as I understand it, could be through meditation, or it could be through a psychedelic experience. It could be, putting it in your pocket and walking to the top of a mountain. It could be having it under your pillow as you have sex or something like this. And this would be considered the magical act, perhaps. And then there's some climax. Maybe you reach the top of the mountain, or you orgasm, or you come down from the trip, and this is the point at which you fire the sigil. You release the sigil to the beyond, and then you can. And then, as far what I've understood is that an important part of the process is this forgetting about it, if you like. And this has helped me to understand that this technique can be understood in a few different ways. And this is quite conventional interpretation that if something is bugging you so much that you're willing to go to the trouble of conducting a magical ritual about it, then probably the best thing you can possibly do is forget about it and like get it off your mind and get on with your life and get on with other things in your life and not let it sort of stay festering in your mind, if you like. So I think there's a kind of quite a straightforward psychological interpretation of like just getting things that are bugging you out of your mind onto a piece of paper, and then getting on with other things. Of course, then there are more esoteric interpretations about what's going on. So and that actually you are, there's some interaction with consciousness or the beyond that we many people would barely profess to understand. So what's your view on these different interpretations of how or why sigilization in particular may work?
Okay, so firstly, that's really, you've given there an excellent breakdown of like the process, I think, and we'll maybe return to the idea of firing and forgetting in a little moment. In terms of which interpretation makes more sense, the answer is it depends on the value of the interpretation. So when I'm explaining something like sigil magic for a sort of a non-esoteric fanboy audience, then it's like, yeah, of course, psychology, which is a subset of science, which is a subset of natural philosophy, which is a subset historically of magic, of course, that's a perfectly reasonable way of explaining it. There are other models, as I'm sure people are familiar with, the idea of, if we could talk about, say, an animist spirit model of what goes on, although it doesn't make it's not coherent, perhaps in the way that we expect scientific discourse to be coherent. Nevertheless, these animist models, certainly understood as a kind of a series of metaphorical descriptions of the world, are very often quite useful, quite interesting. So I don't think there's any privileged description of what's going on. I think there are ones that are better served for different audiences, and there are ones that are perhaps more or less useful in terms of unpicking the thing. And it's also entirely possible that the whole process is just a random series of quote coincidences and there's no agency at all in anything, and it's all laughable. And we must admit that possibility as well. And by admitting all of those possibilities, we can basically have fun and try the technique out, because the technique is the technique is the technique. Now, going back to the thing about firing and forgetting, I would suggest that the most important category of what happens, or what the criteria for what happens in a magical ritual, is to do with the inhabited metaphor, to do with the poetry of the ritual. So, for example, if I create a sigil, my intention of which is to help me find a new place to live, I am uncertain as to whether or not the metaphorical, poetic process of setting it on fire is actually what I want to do. I might want to place it under a stone. I might want to bury it. I might want to do something else with it. Yeah. So I might want to sort of empower that thing and remove it in a certain way. But equally, that thing may be something that I actually want to. I can't let go of whatever this intention is. It's far too important. I can't let go of it. So what else might I do? Well, I might actually make an artwork involving this thing, and I might give it a serious sort of position in my home, on my desk, in my office, whatever's going on. So it's more about the I think getting a good poetic metaphor, the strong poetic metaphor of you send energy into this thing, whatever that is, whether it's imagined as jouissance or chi, or whether it's imagined simply as intention or some sort of informational process that bends the universe in some weird quantum woo-woo way that I have no idea how that would work. Doesn't really matter. But the idea of sending that thing into that thing and then forgetting it, removing it in some way, yeah, totally. And
I mean, maybe we could generalize forgetting to transforming, and the transforming, could be forgetting, but it could also be actually creating something from it, as you said, a piece.
And it has to follow the poetry of the intention, I would suggest. And often, the funny thing about magic is that magic, when it works, looks like normal stuff happening. Of course, it doesn't look like, typically, with the exception of things that happen in people's dreams or other states of consciousness, it doesn't look like Harry Potter. It looks like just events unfolding in the world. But they tend to have a kind of poetry in them, and sort of these metaphorical resonances. And I think that working with that is actually a strong part of what magic is about. It's kind of hard to describe, really, but I imagine you get it.
So, I mean, is it fair to say you're a practicing magician?
Yes.
So, can you say something about why you continue to practice magic then? Is it because it's simply good fun, or is it because you observe that it has produced kind of, material changes in your circumstances, or what is it doing for you right now?
Well, I mean, so I kind of jokingly sometimes think that it's just a mental disorder, and it's my way of coping with it. And I should.
Well, that's. I mean, magical thinking is highly pathologized in the psychiatric literature.
Typically. So I think me and my mates are actually a sort of an autonomous support group, and frankly should get money from the government. But that aside, it's for me the practice. My daily practice looks like a variety of things. Yeah, so pragmatically, it looks like some meditation and some yoga, and then the rest of the time I kind of foray in, as I suspect many people do, to things like a spot of divination. So here are the tarot cards. Let's do some work with something like this, or going for a walk in a way where I kind of ritualize the kind of experience of going for a walk in order to really listen deeply to my environment or whatever. And then sometimes it looks like more explicit magical ritual. So whether that's a ritual where I'm acting as a celebrant or facilitator or whatever for a group of people, or whether it's me and peers doing pieces of magical work. But those things are, I don't spend all of my time casting spells. That's crazy. I spend actually most of my time trying to be in a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of a good relationship with the forces around me, I suppose. Yeah, so that pragmatically that means like a bit of looking after my body by doing a bit of yoga, a bit of looking after my baseline mind state by doing some meditation, and then the rest of the time, having that repertoire of techniques, so I can decide on, okay, I need to do some reflection on past, present, future. I've got the tarot as a skill that I've got and that I'm very familiar with, and then yeah, there are rituals. I mean, I've been involved with a particular magical group, and for the last, I don't know how long now, a while now, certainly the last decade, we've been involved in a series of pieces of ritual which have all been to do with helping to liberate the psychedelic gnosis in our culture. So, and whether or not the strange wavings of hands and mutterings of spells and all of this sort of stuff that me and my mates do makes any direct parapsychological difference to the emergence of the psychedelic renaissance, I have no idea. Of course, I mean, it's just ludicrous. How there's not magic falls down when we start to talk about causality. Really, that's the problem with it.
Yeah.
So
I think you've identified something very useful for me there. That many people are either attracted or put off by the ritual element of it, but and by the idea that magicians cast spells, and some people think that's amazing, and other people find it just total nonsense. But actually, what I heard from you there is magic, or at least to be a magician, is it's a path, it's a way of life as much as it is anything to do with rituals and spells, and that perhaps involves getting in right relationship with your body, the people around you, and the natural world, so that you are able, or so that when the opportunity or necessity for ritual comes up, you are well prepared, well placed to actually do that in an effective way. Do you think there's something?
No. I mean, it's kind of weird. It's weird for me, right? Because I was, I'm nearly 50, and I was born in the home counties in England. So I'm a person who's always been fascinated with, engaged in, and doing this stuff. Who comes from somewhere that I haven't got a tradition, so I can't really straightforwardly call myself anything in terms of what my practice is, whether it's shaman or magician or whatever. I'm this kind of ahistoric entity. But I also know that this is kind of somehow fundamentally a sort of, it is like maybe it is like a neuroatypicality. It's a certain view of the world. And I share that with a bunch of other people who are other sort of practitioners in this field. I guess I often think about, so what? That's like our way of coping with stuff. I think the thing that's interesting for me is that part of what magic is often about is about being able to help other people. Yeah. So a lot of it, whether it's divination, whether that's facilitating ceremony, and it doesn't mean that you're any better than anyone else. Yeah. No, you're not necessarily intrinsically any healthier, just in the same way that a doctor may be a good doctor but may not, can still get ill. Doesn't mean you're better. But part of what you can do is offer the opportunity to sort of relate to things in the world in a certain way, and sometimes people find that beneficial and helpful. So I get asked all kinds of weird things. Someone will contact me and say, "Oh, we've got this weird atmosphere in our house. Could you come and help?" And it's like, well, that obviously means that they have certain sort of beliefs about the world or whatever, and I'm very, very open-minded about these things, because I think it's more to do with the description and the benefits we get from things about what you do. But you're invited into that setting, or someone says, I'd like to have a hand fasting, I'd like to have a ritual which is a ritual symbolic bonding of two people together, and you kind of use your practice of this kind of being, I hope, kind of sensitive and aware of these kind of interconnections of the world. A lot of what magic is predicated on is this notion that the whole of the universe is interconnected. So that's why it's really, really strongly related to things like the psychedelic state, because in the psychedelic state we know that all of your neurons are interconnected suddenly, pretty much.
Yeah. Let's move on to that then a bit, and so we'll talk about the relationship between altered states of consciousness and magic, starting with the relationship between psychedelics and magic. What's going on there? What's the interface there? How they're related?
I was at the Beyond Psychedelics conference in Prague recently, and there was a presentation there that someone provided which was delightful, and it was looking at the effects of holotropic breath work in relation to the effects of, I think it was low doses of psilocin or something like this. And what was interesting was that these two things, the subjective reports of those states of awareness map basically identically on each other, which is really fascinating. So the relationship is that whether we use drugs to do these things, or whether or not we use other kinds of practices, and magic, particularly chaos magic, goes around mining what the technique is. So the Sufis, what do? Well, they do protracted periods of spinning and singing and blah. And actually, this is a very common thing. Dancing, we know, induces all kinds of different types of trance. So all the different methods of doing these things, they basically realize brain states that are really, really similar. And broadly speaking, we know what happens. So the default mode network, the narrative sense of I is turned down to some extent, and that novel connectivity begins to exist within the brain, often through regions that typically don't speak to one another. So we enter this state of awareness, which is firstly, it's tremendously plastic. So we can take a psychedelicized brain, and we can give it a religious, beautiful experience, or we can utterly terrorize it, because the brain state is very highly plastic. It's very mobile, and so if we do, say, a ritual, let's take the example of a sigillization process, going back to that example. If we do enter an altered state of consciousness, then we take this intention, and even if we just purely think of this as a psychological operation, right, so no quantum woo involved, by putting this intention in a form which is kind of very immediately, viscerally, metaphorically understood, so it's a graphic image, putting that into our essentially vulnerable psychedelic brain, one might, it's not hard to imagine how that might be a very effective way of doing it, rather than just kind of, looking at it, in between sort of washing up and doing whatever. It's the part of it is that you're dropping this intention into this mind. The other side of it is, if you do things like divination, what you're often doing is you're often trying to achieve this kind of state, so that the narrative that's produced in, for example, laying down tarot cards, is one in which new possibilities are understood that previously weren't apparent. And occasionally, weird parapsychologically looking stuff kind of happens as well. But broadly, a lot of this could be described in quite easy psychological terms.
Yeah. And okay, well, let's. And how about the placebo effect in magic? I've just actually finished a really good book on the placebo effect called "You Are the Placebo," and going from based on the idea that actually, well, firstly, the placebo effect is very real and potentially useful to people in being able to make changes in their life that they desire. And furthermore, that actually you don't even need to take a sugar pill to get the benefit of the placebo effect. That various experiments have been done, in fact, where people are told that what they're taking is a placebo, and they still improve, or they still get benefit relative to taking nothing at all. So, which strongly suggests that it's actually our own will, our own mind, our own intention that is really at play here, or is maybe the major part of that effect. So, yeah, to dwell on the role of intention and of belief in magic, the idea of setting an intention seems to be very important to very many different techniques, magical techniques, if you like. And I've actually often thought in various parts of life, including when I was studying physics, that figuring out the question, or if you like, figuring out what you want, is the hardest part of the whole thing. And if you can do that, then everything else kind of falls into place. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, to take the last part, a lot of the idea of magic as well is that there are all these processes that are built into it. I mean, people would think about the whole sort of, circles and summoning demons and all that shit, but a lot of the process is about receptivity, listening, being kind of trying to allow the kind of the default mode network sense of self to have some ongoing dialogue with this, that kind of deep mind, collective, unconscious kind of content. So it's such an interesting thing. Intention is certainly a really kind of essential sort of part of that process, and being able to spend time kind of reflecting on, so what is it I want, and being able to think about, how these things sort of flow together is really, really essential. And I think that idea of that we can kind of program ourselves to do things, essentially, that we can arrive at these processes. So hypnosis is another great example, which allows us to do things like anaesthetize people successfully for operations. So, this is an objective process that definitely works. This is not just, a peripheral effect. This is something really important. Really important. And of course, historically, we know, and for understandable reasons, placebo has been a thing that we just correct for in drug trials. But if we also think about how, let's imagine that your classic shamanic healing experience. So let's imagine that you take someone and you give them some ayahuasca, and maybe you take the ayahuasca as well. And what you do is you then lay that person down, and you use feathers and you use smoke and you use all kinds of things to heal them of whatever their difficulty is. Now that's assuming that person has some sort of relationship with the concept of shamanism. So they believe in some sense that it is powerful. That's an amazingly hyper placebo environment, isn't it? I mean, we know about how placebo effect works in terms of giving people pills, or giving people surgery. We know that placebo surgery, unsurprisingly, is more powerful typically than placebo pills. We understand this effect very well. So to put someone in a psychedelic state of awareness and then to do actions with them or to them in some way that have this powerful metaphorical process and meaning, and have often been curated by lots of practitioners watching basically what seems to work, it means that we have access to this other healing potential within us, which does seem to be really quite significant. Yeah. So all the pharmacology that we've had for the last forever, pretty much, to deal with mental illness has utterly failed. Basically, it's utterly failed, and it would seem that at least some of the capacity to heal from trauma exists within this other state of awareness. So that's where we should put our efforts and our intentions into understanding that. It could be just the medicine we need.
Okay, let's move on again to asking who else is using magic. So there are, my understanding is there are various kind of magical orders out there and covens and so on that one can seek out and attempt to join. But how widespread are these practices? Are there people that you have some feeling are using them kind of secretly?
Are they baddies? Is that what you're asking?
Or maybe even unintentionally? Is it possible to unintentionally be involved in magic or using magic practices, or is it something that you always really have to know that you're going into?
Well, I mean, in common with anyone with a really pronounced delusion, I think that in a sense everything is magical, and therefore I would suggest that if you think of marketing is the most obvious example. I mean, the sigilization process that we've discussed. this is like a little spin on that, isn't it? To the point where people will get things tattooed on them, and it's not even like I necessarily think that that's a bad thing. It's just a thing. That's how culture works. We work through imaginal structures. I have imaginal structures which. Pieces of paper with a picture of the Queen on there, apparently worth money, and then series of numbers in pixels on a screen that have it's all based on this kind of like imaginal process
of belief in certain structures.
Yeah. I mean, there is a real world out there, and it's not about a kind of a solipsism, but it is about realizing that most of what affects most of human experience are these imaginal, linguistic, cultural structures, many of which are not in any sense real. They're certainly not unchanging by any stretch of imagination over time or geography. So they're very, they're strange things, and that's where we live. So I would suggest that everyone is to some extent kind of subject to the magical activities of others. So the idea of here we are, we're an organization. What are we going to do? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a symbol which represents our organization, which kind of subtly allows you to remember it, but doesn't immediately give you the words. Now that's basically just sigilization, or creating and that's what everyone does. So we do this all the time. So I think it's more to do with there are people who are more or less aware of these. And whether it doesn't really matter if you call it magic or you call it like I don't know, like active semiotics, or whether what your approach is to understanding this kind of interpenetrating set of belief tunnels. One of which happens to be the one you occupy, but also that you can play around with that by lots of different means.
I really like this idea of marketing and advertising as a form of sigil magic. So. But something else I've got from what you said is really the magic is just one way of seeing the world, and that perhaps emphasizes interconnectedness and maybe also humility, perhaps, or just this sense of not knowing and not needing to know quite how everything is working, focusing more simply on what feels good and what seems to work, and rather than spending all one's time puzzling over what exactly is going on. And it's and of course, in some sense, the magical practice, the most notable magical practice in society at large today is science. And I've heard, it's interesting to consider CERN, the particle collider, as a huge magical ritual space, of course, where our magicians, or physicists, as we call them nowadays, come together and literally manifest matter from energy. And it's been interesting with the discovery of the Higgs boson that it behaves almost exactly how they predicted it would behave. And I've wondered whether, to what extent it was the belief and the desire of these physicists for it to behave in that way that meant that it when it was discovered, it actually did. And coming back to this question of whether science is a process of discovery, that is, it's already out there, and we're sort of uncovering stuff and being like, I found it, or whether we ourselves, as in mind, or as part of mind at large, are actually creating science, and in that context, whether our will and our intention has some effect on what science is discovered, where and how the universe, the new science of the universe evolves, if you like. Do you have some thoughts on the relationship between modern science and magic?
Wow, that's some big stuff there, Stephen. I mean, I think that it's for me, it's about having. I like having multiple discourses. So it's not, is it this or is it that or whatever. It's just like here are these fascinating ways of thinking about what's going on, and are they discovering something, or are they making something manifest? Well, perhaps it's a both and rather than an either or, and certainly in terms of maintaining these multiple kind of storylines about what's going on, I think that's for me a really important thing. If we look historically, as I mentioned before, science is a discipline. It's an approach to understanding knowledge which flows from natural philosophy, which was the both in terms of alchemy giving rise to chemistry, and also in terms of natural philosophy giving rise to things like physics. Those approaches to knowledge are ones that are really interesting, because they have to be about this kind of peculiar sort of falsifiability, and this process of being able to kind of exclude data, and obviously increasingly a process of like refining quite complex statistical data. So there's the Higgs boson. It's not seen, it's understood as a series of peaks in a series of pieces of data, and that's really, really fascinating. It's really, really fascinating kind of sort of way of establishing what we consider to be knowledge. I think it is an uncovering. I think that there is a universe out there, but I think that the dialogue between our experience of the universe and the slice of it that we can ever hope to kind of have any connection or understanding or scientific knowledge of, realizing the limits of that is perhaps really quite interesting and quite important.
I'm attracted to the idea that it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. It's neither quite like we're determining exactly what we're going to find as humanity, as human minds, but neither is it that there is some absolute truth out there to be uncovered. But like the absolute is we're having a conversation with the absolute, and together we work out what it is that that's discovered next, or is created next. Something about that appeals to me.
I think that part of it for me is that a lot of the language, when we start to talk about these very rarefied and kind of complicated and folded back on themselves ideas, is that, like when we talk about the psychedelic experience, we're actually sort of better off going to metaphor and poetry than anything else. Not that these things are ineffable in the sense that we shouldn't sort of attempt to describe them. And indeed, we spend a lot of time trying to describe them. But I often wonder whether or not our anxiety about is it this or is it that is predicated on the fact that you and I are both essentially tubes with arms and legs. And so so our fundamental description of the world is it outside my tube or is it inside my tube? And that's really important. If we were starfish, we'd have different anxieties, I suspect. So a lot of this kind of, it becomes like a discussion about topology rather than a discussion about anything more philosophical, really, in some respects. I mean, this is where the idea that sort of everything is magic kind of falls down. I mean, I suppose that if we go back to that point about who's doing magic out there in the world, yes, there are lots of different kind of styles of magician. There are lots of different styles of organisation. The vast majority of them, certainly in my experience, are predicated on really quite sort of empowering and essentially quite sort of groovy sets of ideas of one form or another. And they come in lots and lots of different stripes. But equally, there is magic that takes place at this completely unconscious level. I mean, no one in CERN, actually, that's not entirely true. That few people, as I understand it, in CERN, would explicitly understand this as a magic circle, as being, so in the lineage of the sort of thing that Dr. John Dee would have been standing in. But I think historically you could make an argument for it. Certainly, and definitely poetically you can, and a lot of magic is about this kind of poetry. And that's why it doesn't tend to worry about is this true or is this not true. It's like, well, that doesn't really matter. It's like Robert Graves' idea of the poetic truth, and that's a really powerful idea. Is it true that I'm trying to heal the person by giving them a placebo pill? Well, yes, it is, but of course I'm giving them a pill that is inactive, blah, blah, blah. It's this in-betweenness, this liminal space where lots of magic operates, I think.
And the result of which, has been to me since coming across this worldview, that life is simply more fun and more interesting, and I think that's would be my main. If anyone is interested in exploring magic further and needs a good reason to do it, they would be the main reasons that I would suggest. Not necessarily because you're going to be able to sort of, shoot fireballs out of your fingertips anytime soon, but that it's about a re-enchantment of the world, and being able to look at things with fresh eyes in actually quite a similar way that many people experience in the psychedelic state, this experience of everything seeming new and interesting again. For me, magic has kind of extended that almost, in maybe not as in intensely as under the influence of psychedelics, but there's something similar there to me, and it strikes me as rather sad when people seem almost like triggered by the thought of magic or any discussion of magic, and have this sense of no, like I know what's going on, science is the truth. Science doesn't include magic. Thus it's nonsense. And they sit there and fold their arms and kind of stamp.
I mean, I don't know those people. I've not encountered those people. I know that they exist sort of as a trope within culture, but I don't know, because most of the time I kind of think, well, okay, you can imagine that many of these behaviours are either anachronistic or the sort of self-fulfilling prophecies or whatever. You must nevertheless acknowledge the psychological significance or possibly power of those things, at least for those individuals who are deploying these kinds of techniques. And we certainly must acknowledge the fact that whether we believe it's temporal lobe epilepsy or whatever we happen to call it, the religious experience, the peak experience, the mystical experience, the experiences that can be reached very reliably with psychedelics and less reliably, but nevertheless over a short period of time, but reliably over longer periods of time, other sort of techniques to get these mystical experiences, those things are important. They're certainly important historically. So even if you're going to say they're not true, you must understand them in their own terms. So here are some of the, let's imagine some of the great religious teachers. Let's imagine, Muhammad and Jesus and Moses and Buddha. So all these people, all these blokes go off and something happens to them, and then they come back and they teach these new great teachings. What happens to them all? All of them go off and they do something. They go into the wilderness. They spend time on a mountain. The only one who tells us what they did was Buddha, and he says, I did meditation. So you at least have to say these techniques of changing awareness, whether we just focus just on purely on meditation, that they have some significance and some import in the world, and that's just a fact. And if you think that that's off limits, then that's really, really weird. Surely, I don't quite understand that. It's an important part of the human experience.
So, I mean, over the past decade or so, we've witnessed a mindfulness revolution, if you like, and now people now talk about psychedelic renaissance, and I've wondered whether the next step in this story is a certain magical renaissance, and whether some of the ideas that we've been speaking about will re-enter popular culture, will re-enter society, and people will be able to simply use them for their to live happier, healthier lives in the way that people are using meditation and psychedelics, and that it's not seen as something dangerous or weird. It's although it can be, and of course you could say that these magic should be used, practiced responsibly in the same way that psychedelics should be used responsibly, or indeed meditation. I've seen people that seem to be on the edge of psychotic breakdowns after 10-day Vipassana retreats, like throwing themselves into these long extended silent retreats when they really weren't ready for it. So all of these practices have their dangers, I think. But do you sense some of these ideas re-entering the mainstream over the years?
Yes, I can. And I can, my ideal thoughts about this, I suppose, our idealized sort of outcome, that I was talking to the Psychedelic Society in Amsterdam night before last, I think it was, and doing a sort of talk for those guys there, which is lovely. And one of the things I was talking about was this idea that, when LSD came into culture, we invented the rock music festival, right? So that was our kind of cultural response to this psychedelic substance. Then when MDMA came into our culture, we responded by creating the rave and the chill out zone and blah blah blah, and that's what we did. So that was our cultural response in terms of ritual behavior to that substance. So what's happening now in the psychedelic renaissance? Well, what I would argue is that we have the opportunity for, and I know it's a problematic term, but let's just use it because it does really fit, is a kind of the shamanic approach, by which I mean the approach where we are curating spaces, often slightly more intimate spaces than you have within a festival. You could have one of these approaches take place at a festival, but essentially we're seeing the emergence of the idea of the medicine circle, medicine rituals, psychedelic experience stuff, which has a ritual element to it. And the ritual element to it can be very diverse, very eclectic, very, down the line, embodied within one tradition or another. It doesn't really matter. But as a behavior, what I think we're seeing is this idea of creating and curating these spaces. And hopefully we'll just get better and better at it, and practitioners who do this well will thrive, and people who are doing it less well will get better support or stop doing it. But that's, I think, what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing this proliferation of these ceremonial spaces for taking psychedelics in. And that's where magic has something to say, because one of the things that magic has to say is that here are the underlying, particularly chaos magic, but lots of the magical tradition does this, is to say here are the underlying processes that people are doing. And if you can sort of understand those, then you can assemble a ceremony that will work for you, will work for your peer group, and will hold things in a good and supportive way. And that could include someone who's a South American shaman, whatever, or it could include someone who's a Norwegian runic practitioner, and a bunch of people who have basically no religion but can understand a simple symbol repertoire that's delivered well. Yeah, so you don't even have to sign up to any particular belief system. You don't have to identify as a pagan. You don't necessarily have to go and get a shaman from some faraway place. It becomes a series of behaviours of curating these spaces that we do better and better with the wide variety of substances that we've now got available. That's what I hope.
I'm right with you on that. I think there's a lot of utility in thinking about these practices and integrating them into our work. And I think we'll wrap up our conversation soon. But I believe you've written a book, Julian, that might be relevant to somebody.
I have, mate. I've written a book called Getting Higher, The Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony, which is what it says on the tin. It's basically, as far as I understand it, it's my take on some of these techniques, and collections of different things that people can go and try out, a few examples of stuff that I've done, just as kind of, for instances of practice, but it's really designed to empower people to go and create their own ritualized containers for the substances that they're using, so they can use those in a really good way. I've written stuff previously which is about psychedelics, and there's a lot of my stuff just online at the blog of baphomet.com, so people can go and check that out.
I've read the book, and it's fantastic, and it's been very influential on me. And you're also running retreats now, and I've attended one of your retreats, the Deep Magic retreats. And I think there's another one coming up soon.
There's another one coming up towards the end of September, and another one in November. So we've got details on our Facebook page. So if you just search for Deep Magic, then you'll find it from there. Or go, like I said, to the blog address, and you can find all the links and stuff from there. It's been really, really good. We've had this, as you know, this opportunity to work with a site in North Cornwall, St Nectan's Glen, which is this beautiful magical space that's now got a retreat on it. And so being able to kind of work with that landscape is a real honour. It's a beautiful place.
Wonderful. I hope to be along at another one at some point in the
near future. Please do. It's great to have you there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julian, and speak to you again soon.
All right. See you later. Ciao.